Okay, so if I ask you to visualize the Spanish Empire, the conquest of the Americas, what image popped into your head?
Well, it's pretty standard, isn't it? It's the guys in the jungle.
Exactly. Guys in those distinct Morean helmets, sweating in armor, hacking through vines with swords. It's a very physical, very violent picture. Gold, glory, blood.
That's the Hollywood blockbuster version for
Yeah.
sure. It's visceral, and it focuses completely on that conquistador
Yeah.
archetype. The
Yeah.
lone warrior changing the world with nothing but steel and grit.
But the sources we've been looking at for this deep dive, they paint a totally different and honestly a much stranger picture. They suggest the Spanish Empire wasn't really built by soldiers.
It was built by lawyers.
Yes, it wasn't just forged in battle. It was constructed in lecture halls in Salamanca and stuffy bureaucratic offices in Madrid.
And that's a huge shift in perspective. We tend to forget that Spain was an incredibly, well, legalistic society.
Mm.
They were obsessed with paperwork, with theology, with legitimacy. So the conquest wasn't just a physical invasion. It was a massive intellectual project. They didn't just want to take the land. They needed to prove, almost like a math problem, that they had the right to take it.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack the machinery behind the conquest. We're not just talking about battles. We're talking about the founding fathers of colonial thought, the the absurd legal rituals they performed on beaches.
And the rigid, almost corporate structure they built to manage an entire continent.
Because, as the sources show, you don't hold an empire together for 300 years just by swinging a sword.
No, you do it with bureaucracy. You do it by creating a mental framework that justifies everything. And that brings us right to the first big hurdle the Spanish crown faced. It's this big question that was apparently keeping King Charles V up at night.
And that question was?
Who actually owns this land?
Which seems like a wild question to ask after you've already started taking it.
Right. But the source material really highlights this crisis of conscience in Spain. You've got millions of people already living there. They have their own societies, their own rulers, their own laws.
So how do you possibly justify showing up and just saying, okay, this is ours now?
It wasn't as simple as just might makes right. Spain wanted to be seen as a moral superpower, a Christian kingdom. So they turned to their think tanks,
The School of Salamanca.
specifically the School of Salamanca. And the main guy here is a friar named Francisco de Vitoria. In legal circles, he is a massive deal. I mean, he's often called the father of international law.
And when you first read Vittoria's arguments, he sounds surprisingly modern. He looks at the indigenous people and says,
These are rational human beings.
exactly. He argues they have dominion over their own property. He even shoots down the idea that the Pope or the Emperor automatically owns the whole globe.
He does. He totally dismantles that old medieval divine right to just grab territory. But, and this is a massive, but this is where the legal gymnastics begin.
Oh, here we go.
Vittoria gives the natives their property rights with one hand, and then he builds this incredibly elegant trap with the other.
This is the part that just blew my mind. He comes up with this idea of natural rights, but not the way we think of them today.
Not at all. He argues there's a natural right to travel, to trade, and to preach the gospel. He says the Spanish have a universal right to go anywhere on earth and conduct business or spread their faith.
So it's like a really aggressive open door policy. He's basically saying, we have a right to come into your house and talk to you about Jesus.
Pretty much. And here's the trap.
Uh,
If the indigenous people stop the Spanish from trading or preaching,
yeah.
if they say, no, go away,
Then they're the ones breaking the law.
exactly. By blocking these natural rights, the natives become the aggressors.
And once they're the aggressors, Spain has the legal justification to wage a just war in self-defense.
Precisely. It turns a literal invasion into a police action. It's a brilliant, if deeply cynical, piece of legal theory.
It's the ultimate heads I win, tails you lose. But, okay, Vittoria wasn't the only voice in this. The whole debate got really heated. The sources talk about this huge showdown in 1550, the Valladolid debate. It sounds like the heavyweight championship of colonial philosophy.
It really was. You had two polar opposites just screaming at each other
Yeah.
about the very nature of humanity. In one corner, you've got Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. He's the hawk. He's a student of Aristotle, and he's pushing this concept of natural slavery.
Natural slavery. Just the phrase, makes your skin crawl.
It's a harsh idea.
Ugh.
Sepúlveda argued that the indigenous peoples were barbarians, that they lacked the capacity for self-rule. Therefore, it wasn't just okay to conquer them. He framed it as an act of charity. They needed Spanish masters to civilize them.
A benevolent intervention.
That was the argument.
And in the other corner, you have the famous Bartolomé de las Casas. And his backstory is so interesting because he wasn't some academic. He was an encomendero. He owned land and slaves in the Caribbean.
He was part of the system until he saw the devastation firsthand. The sources describe his transformation as a complete psychological break with his past. He becomes the fiercest critic of the entire Spanish project.
So at Valladolid, he argues the exact opposite.
The exact opposite. He says the natives are fully rational, spiritual beings with souls, and that the brutal wars of conquest are a mortal sin. He wanted peaceful conversion, not subjugation.
And usually in the history books, Las Casas is painted as the hero, the good guy. But the sources here suggest it's a bit more complicated.
It's more complicated. He won the moral argument. The crown did eventually agree with him that natives shouldn't be enslaved in the same way, but he didn't actually stop the empire.
He just shifted the justification.
That's the tragic irony. By convincing the crown that the natives were people with souls who needed to be saved, he inadvertently gave them a stronger, more permanent reason to stay. The mission changed from conquest to protection and conversion. It gave the whole administration a humanitarian guise.
So instead of leaving, they just rebranded. We aren't conquerors anymore, we're guardians.
And that rebranding is powerful. It allows the bureaucracy to expand because now you need priests and churches and administrators to oversee all this protection.
Speaking of bureaucracy, we have to talk about the Requerimiento. Because if Vittoria gives them the theory, the Requerimiento is the practical application. And it reads like a dark comedy sketch.
It is the absolute pinnacle of what you might call bureaucratic absolution. The Requerimiento, or the requirement, was a legal document. The crown mandated that before any conquistador could attack a village, they had to read this thing out loud.
It's basically a terms of service agreement, but at knife point.
That's a perfect analogy. The document explains the entire history of the world from Adam and Eve. It explains the authority of the Pope, and then it demands that the locals submit to the King of Spain.
And the reality of this, I'm picturing a guy in plate armor standing on a beach shouting at people who speak Maya or Quechua.
It was completely absurd. The sources mention captains reading it to empty forests because the villagers had all fled.
To an empty forest?
Yes. Or reading it from the deck of a ship miles offshore. Or reading it in Spanish to people who, had absolutely no idea what was happening.
But to the Spanish mind, the act of reading it was more important than anyone actually understanding it.
Because it checked the box. Once the document was read, the Spanish had fulfilled their legal duty to warn the natives. If the natives didn't immediately surrender, which of course they couldn't, the Spanish could attack with a clear conscience. It legalized the slaughter.
It's the paperwork that kills the conscience. Okay, so we've got the legal cover, but let's get to the mechanics of the actual conquest. We started by saying the lone conqueror image is a myth. The numbers really back that up. You look at Cortez attacking Tenochtitlan.
The Aztec capital.
Yeah, he has, 500 Spaniards? And the city has 200,000 people? The math just doesn't work.
It's impossible. You cannot topple an empire of millions with a few hundred guys, no matter how good your steel is.
So what's the missing piece?
The lone conqueror myth ignores the single biggest factor: politics.
Right. The sources get really deep into the indigenous political landscape. The Aztecs weren't just, sitting around peacefully. They were an empire, and a brutal one.
They were imperialists. They extracted heavy taxes and blood sacrifices from neighboring tribes. The Tlaxcalans, for instance, absolutely hated the Aztecs.
So Cortez didn't have to conquer them.
No, he just had to walk in and offer partnership. He was a master manipulator.
So it wasn't Spain versus the Americas. It was a massive civil war, and Spain just picked a side.
Exactly. When the Spanish army marched on Tenochtitlan, the vast majority of that army was indigenous. We're talking tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and other native warriors. The Spanish were just the tip of the spear, the catalyst. They exploited local grievances to dismantle the empire from the inside.
So they were diplomats as much as soldiers. But there's one other factor here. The silent partner in all of this.
The biology.
The biological catastrophe.
It is the grim backdrop to this entire story. Smallpox, measles, influenza. The indigenous populations had zero immunity.
The mortality rates in the research they're apocalyptic. Upwards of 90% in some regions.
90%. It's a number so large, it's hard to even wrap your head around. It hollowed out the continent.
And the psychological impact must have been devastating.
For both sides. The Spanish saw this mass death as divine providence. They thought, God is clearing the path for us, we must be right. And for the indigenous people to see their families and leaders dying while the invaders remained healthy, it just shattered their worldview. It made resistance feel hopeless.
So it's a combination of legal tricks, political alliances, and this biological horror. But once the dust settles, Spain has to actually run the place. And this brings us to the systems they set up, which were just brutal in their efficiency.
Well, the bottom line was extracting wealth, and for that, you need labor. The sources highlight two main systems. First was the encomienda.
Which sounds a lot like feudalism.
It was. The crown would grant a Spaniard, the encomendero, a certain number of natives. He was supposed to protect them and teach them Catholicism.
Then in return.
They owed him their labor. It was a simple transaction. I save your soul. You mine my gold.
But then it shifts. The sources talk about the Mita system, especially in the Andes, and this one seems even more cynical.
It was, because they took an existing Inca system and corrupted it. The Inca had a system called Mita, which was a form of public service, like a community work project.
A social contract.
Right. The Spanish kept the name Mita, but they stripped away all the reciprocity. They turned it into a forced labor draft, specifically for the silver mines.
Ah, Potosi.
Potosi. The source material calls it the mountain that eats men.
And it really was, wasn't it?
It was hell on earth. You're talking about high-altitude mines, toxic mercury dust. The life expectancy was horrific. But that silver funded the entire Spanish Empire for a century.
And to manage all this, the mines, the farms, the millions of people, they needed a rigid social structure. This is where the casta system comes in.
It was a racial hierarchy that was literally encoded into law. It determined everything about your life. Your job, your taxes, who you could marry.
So walk us through the corporate ladder of the Spanish Empire. Who's at the top?
At the very top, the C-suite, you have the peninsulares. These are Spaniards born in Spain. They hold all the top jobs, viceroy, archbishop. They're the only ones trusted with real power.
And right below them, hitting that glass ceiling, are the Criollos.
The Creoles. People of pure Spanish blood, but born in the Americas. They're wealthy, they own the mines and the big estates, but, and this is key, they're barred from the highest offices. The king didn't fully trust them.
Which seems like a huge strategic error. You're alienating the wealthy, powerful people who actually run the place.
It was a fatal flaw. That resentment from the Criollos is exactly what fuels the independence movements later on. Simon Bolivar was a Criollo.
And then below them, you get the mixed populations.
The mestizos, who are mixed Spanish and native, and the mulattoes, mixed Spanish and African. And then at the very bottom, you have the native and African slave populations. It was a pyramid designed for control.
The way they managed all this from Madrid is, a pre-digital marvel. How do you stop a viceroy in Mexico from just declaring himself king?
Paranoia and paperwork.